others. Thanks for coming back to our Curtin Corner webinars. It's great to have you here. I'm John Phillimore. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Executive Director of the John Curtin Institute of Public Policy at Curtin University, and I really am very pleased to have you here at this evening's Curtin Corner. This is scheduled to be our last one, but we might just sneak one in next week on the US election. I'll tell you a bit about that at the end of the session. Of course, I will begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands from which we are viewing today's webinar. And in Bentley, of course, that is the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. So wherever you are, I would like to pay respects to traditional owners and their elders past and present. And if you have not attended a Curtin Corner before, we've been running these things for about 15 years, certainly since I've been at Curtin, and on Friday afternoon during semester with speakers from outside and inside the university on a variety of topics related to public policy. We used to always meet either in the city or here on Bentley at the council chambers, and we'd have drinks and nibbles afterwards. But nowadays, because we've all gone COVID sensible with webinars, you can have your drinks and nibbles while you're watching, and I won't see you or see you doing it, but hopefully you'll still pay attention. And so far things have been going pretty well. Today, slight difference, I'll be probably pressing the button while Jeanette is talking as we go through the slides, but hopefully it'll all work out fine. We do record the session and put it up on our website. That usually takes about a week. All the sessions from this semester are now up on our website. If you've missed any or you want to go back and look at them, so please, I encourage you to go to the website and also talk to your colleagues and friends. If you've seen a talk you really want, you think they would enjoy, please ask them to go to the website. So the format for the Curtin Corner is that our speaker, Jeanette, will be presenting for about 35 minutes or so, 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll leave plenty of time for question and answer sessions. We aim to finish by around 5, but if it goes to 5:15, that'll be our latest. So 5:15 at the absolute outside. For question and answer, we use this program called Slido, S-L-I-D-O. So you can go to www.slido.com, either download the app or just do it on the internet that way. Our event code on Slido is 7181. And you'll already see a question up there from me just to get the ball rolling, and you know you're in the right spot. So with Slido, you submit a question, or you can like someone else's question. I'll then facilitate the Q&A based on the questions submitted, and the likes will help me know which questions people are most interested in. And as I've said in the past, it's often best to, I think, access Slido on your mobile, and that way you can watch the presentation on your computer screen. So now to our speaker for today, Jeanette Roberts. Jeanette has got more than 35 years international experience in the oil and gas industry, and that experience covers the entire oil and gas value chain and delivering projects all over the world, including Africa, Europe, the UK, the former Soviet Union, and Asia. And she's an active participant in Australia's oil and gas industry, and she's passionate about developing Australian homegrown talent in the industry. And she's also engaged in policy development and industry leadership at state and Commonwealth level. Jeanette is a bit of a Curtin Corner regular. She's given 2 previous presentations, one in 2018 on gas market challenges, and one last year on jobs and growth in the gas industry. Many of you might know that the state government has an LNG jobs task force. I'm not quite sure what the status of that is during COVID, but certainly it's one of its major policy initiatives. The slide presentations for both those talks are on our website. You just go back and look up 2018 or 2019 Curtin Corners and you'll see those slide presentations. And so today in Melbourne Cup Week, Jeanette completes the trifecta by speaking about the Browse LNG project, a project that has loomed large in discussions in WA about the future of the gas industry in Western Australia for many years. But it always seems to be coming, it's coming, it's coming. So today, Jeanette's going to tell us where it's actually at and what we might expect from it, and is it a good or a bad thing. So I would like to thank Jeanette very much for agreeing also to postpone the talk, which was scheduled a couple of weeks ago, but for various internal reasons here at JCIPP, we weren't able to proceed on that day. So thank you very much, Jeanette, for being flexible. And also to you, our attendees, some of you were looking forward to that, I'm sure, a couple of weeks ago. So thank you for coming back and delaying that for a couple of weeks. So once again, now it is very much my pleasure to introduce Jeanette Roberts to give her presentation on the Browse project. Over to you, Jeanette.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks so much for those kind words. Before I start, I do have to pick up on the Melbourne Cup reference. I'm a Melburnian. You know, I went to school and university in Melbourne, 3rd generation Melbourne Uni, my daughter's 4th generation, and have strong links. And for me, Melbourne Cup is only exam time. You know, that's what I think about for Melbourne Cup. So that's for a Melburnian like me, it's not as big a deal as it is sometimes here in WA. Look, thanks very much everybody for attending. I know it's a bit dry when we can't be here in person. And I look forward to the opportunity when we can all meet in person again in the future. As John said, I'm going to give a bit of a talk about where we're at on the Browse project and the interface with the Northwest Shelf. I now work, as John mentioned, I now work as an independent consultant and non-executive director. And I do have to tell you that these are really my personal opinions based on my experience. There'll be others who disagree with some of the positions that I've made, and that's fine, and it would be good to pick up that dialogue in the Q&A. I also know there's some people on the call who are very familiar with this project, and I am going to do a bit of history just to sort of set the scene for those who are less familiar. So please bear with me for that. And as I say, I welcome discussion about the various issues and comments that I've made. If we could go to the next slide, John, please. Thanks. So in this presentation, there's quite a lot to get through, but I think we'll be fine. As I say, I want to give a brief history of the project, talk about the reservoirs, the James Price Point concept with which many people will be familiar, the floating LNG options, the options of Browse coming back to Burrup and being Karratha backfill, the issues around the Northwest Shelf Venture and the changes in Northwest Shelf Venture, how the Browse joint venture and the Northwest Shelf Venture fit together, and what that might mean for Woodside and the project and the joint venture and WA, and what might be the national impact. And what we be asking for is policy settings. Again, these are opinions and comments, and I'll look forward to having some debate about that. We could go to the next slide. So for those who aren't not as familiar with the Browse project as I know some of you are, it was discovered in 1971, so it's been a long time now. It's a major gas fields offshore Kimberley and operated by Woodside. And since 2005, there were obviously studies before that, but since 2005, there's been a pretty steady stream of studies and preliminary engineering, even going to the extent of a full-blown front-end engineering and design process, and nearly going into final investment decision on a whole range of development options for this field. So there's been a whole bunch of concepts engineered into various levels of detail. We've looked at fixed platforms, floating platforms, FPSOs, floating production, storage and offloading vessels, floating LNG and concrete platforms. And there's been lots of alternative proposals as to develop this field. If we go to the next slide, we'll be able to see that this is if you see the little inset at the top left, here we are offshore Kimberley. We're a long way away from the Northwest Shelf, particularly, and a lot of the existing gas development, which is offshore Pilbara, you know, vast distances by world terms. And the Browse project is development of 3 reservoirs, Brecknock, Calliope and Tarosa, complicated by the fact that the Tarosa reservoir, the largest one of those 3, is partially in state waters. But you will also see that the tradition in oil and gas is that red is gas and green is oil. You will also see that there's other gas fields there very nearby. And in particular, to the east of the Browse reservoirs are Prelude and Ichthys, both of which have been developed. Prelude as floating LNG by Shell, and Ichthys as going back to Darwin by Impex. So there's already developments in the area very, very close by who are using potentially different concepts and who are also going and not looking at bringing the gas down to Karratha, down to the Pilbara. You'll see on the next slide, the first thing I want to discuss was the James Price Point concept. So as I say, since 2005, there's been a whole range of studies and looking at concepts and looking at different engineering solutions development of this field. And one of the important concepts that came a long way through development was the James Price Point concept. The plan was to develop an LNG processing hub at James Price Point, which is north of Broome, with the idea that this would provide a foundation for economic development in the Kimberley, just as you've seen the economic development further south around the Karratha area. Part of it included an extensive land package to the extensive aid package to traditional owners, and a mandate on the project proponents that there should be local employment and use of local businesses. So the idea was to provide a strong industrial foundation for economic development in this very remote part of the world. If we go to the next slide, we'll be able to see the proposed concept. So the major browse reservoirs, Brecknock, Callants and Callants in particular, are sitting off the edge of the continental shelf in something like 500 metres of water. And for those of you who aren't really familiar with oil and gas development concepts, you know that presents a different challenge to a field that's in shallower water sitting on the continental shelf. So the solution in this case was to put what we call dry tree units, tension leg platforms, floating platforms in the deep water area, in about 500 metres of water, and then coming back to a central processing facility sitting on the continental shelf in 80 to 100 metres of water. And that could be a fixed unit because of the shallow water depth. And then from there you process offshore, and then you come into a greenfield LNG plant at James Price Point, and that's on the right-hand side of the picture, providing liquefaction as you already have existing in other parts of WA, particularly the around Karratha. And of course, part of that would be this is a completely greenfield site, so it would require a lot of utilities and infrastructure investment. So that was the concept. It is technically very sound. The point of the platform sitting in the deep water section was that you would not be using subsea wellheads, you'll be using wellheads sitting on the floating platforms that you could maintain more easily. Technically sound, and provides a new greenfield site and development in the Kimberley, as I said. If you look at the next slide, most of you will remember that there was a lot of support from the previous Premier, Colin Barnett. And in fact, the project was a long way in the development chain, to the extent that it was very, very close to final investment decision. There was community controversy in both ways, of people who favoured the economic development and people who didn't favour the industrial development. And in that context, eventually the concept was dropped in favour of floating LNG. So if we go to the next slide, that's the next of the browse concepts I want to talk about. So floating LNG for browse, as many of you will know, there's the world's first large-scale floating LNG facility sitting on the Prelude Reservoir, which is very close to browse by world standards, relatively very close to browse. The Prelude vessel, the Prelude floating LNG facility has had ongoing problems, as many of you will have read, and ongoing operational challenges. However, before, when floating LNG was being developed for browse, Prelude was still in engineering and development, so those operational challenges were not apparent. So it might be, floating LNG for browse now may be considered even less appealing as a result of the difficulties Shell and INPEX are having with getting Prelude up and running smoothly. However, at the time, floating LNG was considered as a strong contender for browse. It has the advantage that avoids exposure to the productivity and cost challenges associated with construction of a new greenfield LNG plant, because James Price Point is some 60 kilometres north of Broome, Broome is already a remote area in world scale and even in WA. And so construction of a new greenfield LNG plant would have required a great deal of difficulty getting skilled labour and getting the right skills, and the productivity and costs would be very significant. So floating LNG avoids that exposure. It does result in fewer local jobs for the Broome community, and there are social issues and challenges around that. To develop Browse, it's likely that you would need 3 floating LNG units, so that increases the development cost when you compare it with Prelude, that's just a single development unit. So in the end, after a lot of engineering and a lot of challenges, a commercial solution that worked for floating LNG could not be made commercial for the Browse project. So if we go to the next slide, this is kind of where we're at, and we get to today. The concept that's now on the table, as I say, since engineering studies in 2005, 15 years now, is Browse to Burrup. So the concept is to bring the gas from Browse via floating FPSOs, floating production storage, offloading vessels in the field, down to Karratha, the Pilbara, and then to process the gas in the Northwest Shelf existing Karratha gas plant, which is part of the Northwest Shelf venture. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that the proposal to pipe Browse gas down to the Karratha gas plant was an option all along in the early days. There were 7 themes being developed when they were looking at, for example, the concrete substructure solution and some of the other solutions. This Browse to Burrup concept has been on the table for a long time. It obviously requires a pipeline coming from the Kimberley down to the Pilbara, which is about 900 kilometres. But equally, the Ichthys project nearby in the Kimberley has got an 850 kilometre pipeline from Browse Basin back to Darwin. There's issues around lack of synergy of 2 fields in the Kimberley, one piping its gas back to Darwin and one piping its gas down to the Pilbara. But certainly the Ichthys project does demonstrate that if you invest in a long offshore pipeline where you have project certainty around developing their LNG plant in Darwin, there are some great benefits to the project because you get certainty around the timeline and the challenges. So although there's a lack of logic of 2 fields in the Browse Basin, one's going to Darwin, one's coming down to the Pilbara, certainly Ichthys proves the model that if you invest in the long pipeline and can develop your LNG plant in a place where you have confidence, and there was already an LNG plant in Darwin, there's a lot of benefit to the project. If we go to the next slide, the other issues around this is Karratha backfill. So the Karratha gas plant has been in production for a long time. It's starting to have issues with gas supply, and so keeping the plant full is an absolute incentive for the Northwest Shelf venture. And equally, if you bring the gas down to Karratha, you've already got an existing gas plant, you've already got all the infrastructure and the capital. So clearly that's more efficient use of capital than a brand new greenfield LNG plant at James Price Point that requires all the infrastructure and utilities. The required skills and supply chain are already available in Karratha. So there's already workforce and skills to develop this plant. And I think perhaps one of the lessons of Ichthys in Darwin is that we underestimate the level of skilled labour and workforce and challenges associated with getting the right kind of people into a fairly remote area. Darwin's a capital, but it's still fairly remote to build a greenfield LNG plant. Karratha is not a cheap location. Labour costs are still high, but obviously would not be as high as they would have been at James Price Point, where you have to build all this skill base and supply chain from scratch. And there's a lot of political support from Premier McGowan, and that too is valuable in terms of the concept. So if we go to the next slide, my opinion is that ultimately it's commercial trade-off. How much is it going to cost the Browse joint venture to process the gas at Karratha, offset against the additional pipeline cost of some 900 kilometres, bringing the gas down to the Pilbara, and the considerable savings in not building a greenfield LNG plant with all the associated infrastructure and utilities. One question I'd pose that I think is open in my mind is whether there's really any commercial value to the community and political issues. You know, the political support for the various concepts, the community response, whether you can ascribe a commercial value to that. I think in some ways you can, because you get more certainty in your project approvals and more certainty in delivering your project. But if we go to the next slide, I want to talk about issues around the commercial alignment. So the proposal is to take Browse gas, which is operated by the Browse joint venture, down to Karratha to process in the Karratha gas plant, which is obviously operated by the North West Shelf venture. North West Shelf is a really interesting joint venture. It's been in operation for 35 years, and that's a really long time for a commercial enterprise like this to maintain its stability and maintain its current structure. The other example in Australia is the Gippsland joint venture, which is 50-50 SO and BHP in Bass Strait, and that's been going since the late 60s. And again, it's maintained its commercial structure and its joint venture arrangements. And in both cases, the ownership is now in the process of changing. Both SO and BHP are looking at changing out of the Gippsland joint venture, and we'll see that the North West Shelf venture ownership is now changing. The North West Shelf venture for 35 years has been 6 equal co-venturers with Woodside as operator and also a 1/6 partner. And I know everybody I've ever talked to, fortunately, well, in a way, I've not worked on the North West Shelf venture, but everybody I know who has worked on it will talk about, you know, some of the frustrations of the 6 equal co-venturers and working with all that. But it has stood the test of time. It really has, as has the Gippsland joint venture with the 50-50 arrangement. And the fact that both of those joint ventures are now changing ownership is a step in development of Australia's oil and gas industry. If we go to the next slide. So the changes that are afoot with North West Shelf venture, many people will have read about. Chevron have announced that they will sell their North West Shelf interest, and they've got a flyer out to the market. I believe the value they're putting on it is $3 billion, as I recall. Somebody will probably know that in more detail. But they've announced the sale of their interest, and they're looking around. There's rumours about possible buyers, Woodside taking over their share so that they might have 2/6. An infrastructure investor like Macquarie, who were part of Quadrant, who then sold out to Santos, potentially PetroChina, who have interest in Browse. And there's also some rumours that Shell and BHP are considering exiting the North West Shelf venture. And so, given that Chevron are actively trying to sell their share now, and there's rumours around some of the other joint venturers selling out as well, certainly the shape of the joint venture of 35 years of stability of 6 equal co-venturers is changing, and they will certainly have an impact on the Browse commercial negotiations. If we go to the next slide, you'll see the Browse joint venture. So we have Woodside as the operator with 30.6%. So in the Browse joint venture, you do not have the situation of the 6 equal co-venturers, the joint venture partners having an equal stake. You have the Woodside with the largest stake as the operator, Shell, BP, Mimi, which is Mitsubishi Mitsui joint venture, and PetroChina. And that's where it might make sense for PetroChina to buy a Chevron stake in the North West Shelf venture. So if you look at the Browse joint venture, and there was some changes to that ownership some years back, around the time that we're looking at James Price Point concept, but that's currently the ownership. And all of those partners are in the Northwest Shelf venture except PetroChina. So if PetroChina were to take Chevron's share, then that would make sense. Currently, the Northwest Shelf venture, as I say, seeks equal co-venturers: Woodside, Chevron, BP, Shell, BHP, and Mimi. So all those partners are in the Browse joint venture except Chevron and BHP. So Chevron coming out of the Northwest Shelf venture certainly aids the alignment, depending on who buys that share, and perhaps BHP as well. If we go to the next slide, is Browse to Burrup a good idea? Well, that's an issue of debate for, I guess, the room and for the industry and for the Browse joint venture to ultimately make a decision about. In my opinion, the advantages are that a new greenfield LNG plant is not required, and so obviously much more capital efficient, and using existing infrastructure is a good thing. The Karratha gas plant has capacity, and there's labour and supply chain capability available at Karratha, which I think is something that's not to be underestimated. And as I say, even in Darwin, which is a capital city and has already an industrial base, that was a challenge for the Ichthys project in Darwin. There's political support here in WA, and there are common partners across both joint ventures. The disadvantages is that there's a large additional capex for some 900 kilometres of pipeline. One of the big disadvantages at the moment is that it appears, from what we can see, at least from the outside, is that not all the partners are aligned not all the Northwest Shelf partners are aligned in processing the Browse gas, and potentially I'm not sure whether all the Browse partners are aligned in coming down to Karratha. Either way, we're losing that JV alignment. One of the challenges is that time changes, other development concepts become more attractive. You know, the economics of floating LNG change, particularly once Prelude gets up and running. Other options become more attractive, and the LNG market changes as well, and the opportunity for selling the Browse LNG changes as time goes by and other major projects come on stream. For example, the big LNG project that's underdeveloped in Mozambique. One of the things I'd say as a disadvantage for Browse to Burrup is that Australia doesn't have any history of shared infrastructure in the upstream sector. We have joint ventures. Most upstream developments are developed by some form of joint venture, but the idea of a shared infrastructure play and third-party processing is not something where we really have any history. And there's quite a lot of that happening in the US, in particular in the Gulf of Mexico. Whether that really matters, I don't know. I think it's maybe a risk that could be underestimated, and it might be one of those things that is more difficult to achieve in real life than you think it's going to be. So you might say from a Karratha gas plant point of view, look, you know, we know how to do this. We just agree a tariff, we agree supply arrangements, we have contractual arrangements over that. You know, that's relatively straightforward. And at one level it is. But I just wonder whether in the actual day-to-day operation, whether the devil's in the detail. There's more little issues that come up day to day about access to facilities and gas supply and things like that, that makes it much more difficult to actually operate this tariff processing alongside the Northwest Shelf venture gas processing without a lot of experience in how that kind of arrangement might work. I don't know. I think it's a risk that's easily underestimated. If we go to the next slide, we look at some of the commercial considerations. So what are some of the commercial considerations for the Browse joint venture specifically? Well, obviously the capex of a large 900-kilometre pipeline transporting the gas down from the Kimberley. But as I say, Ichthys had an 850-kilometre pipeline from the Kimberley to Darwin. You know, it's doable, but it is a large chunk of money. The timing of the investment, all the economics change depending on when the investment actually happens. And it's already been announced that final investment decision is already delayed till 2023 as a result of COVID and the oil price, and that could potentially slip. The global LNG market is always changing all the time in terms of capacity, different plants coming on stream, and the demand changing. And the demand is uncertain at the moment as a result of COVID and the impact on the oil price and transport and the economies around the world in general. And so the global market at the time of FID will be different to that which it is now, particularly new projects coming online. For example, there's a large greenfield LNG project in Mozambique, which is very exciting. As time changes, the alternative development concepts have different economics. The cost basis changes. So the commercial issues that you're looking at to make an investment decision at the moment are constantly changing with time, and so all those things might potentially result in it making different decisions at different times. And obviously it's a question of what the tariff is versus the cost of implementing an alternative development concept. And as we saw, that there are a number of alternatives that the Browse joint venture could have historically pursued and could still pursue if the Northwest Shelf processing option doesn't work, particularly if the tariff is not at a level that they can sustain. So then we look at, on the next slide, let's look at the commercial issues for the Northwest Shelf venture. I'd say number one, a commercial issue for the Northwest Shelf venture at the moment is uncertainty in the joint venture ownership. And as we say, Chevron pulling out, other partners selling, and so the shape of that ownership and the type of parties that are in that joint venture will change, especially if it's an infrastructure investor. There are some rumours, as I said, that Woodside might buy one of the other participants' interests, so that changes the structure and the commercial structure significantly. So I consider that a really big a commercial issue and risk issue for making a decision about processing Browse gas at Northwest Shelf. But it is really important to keep the Karratha gas plant full. A big LNG plant that's not running at full capacity is really difficult economically and a very expensive prospect. Northwest Shelf Venture has been undertaking a fair bit of exploration in the recent past, looking for additional gas supplies in order to provide their own backfill. But that hasn't really achieved any great discoveries that will underpin this capacity issue. And Woodside and BHP already have substantial gas reserves available at Scarborough, which is 280 kilometres off the coast in the Pilbara area. So really, as I say, it's a commercial trade-off of the tariff revenue versus the cost of alternatives. For example, putting Scarborough through Northwest Shelf or running the plant under capacity. So if we go to the next slide, and think about how the Browse negotiations might look, and I think there's some people on the call who have an insight that I don't have any real insight to this. As I say, I'm an independent consultant. I think, you know, there's probably people who have a stronger view about things than me around this. But in my opinion, there's a very good chance that really, whichever way this goes, the ultimate outcome is delay. So the Browse project has already been delayed due to COVID and economic downturn and oil price. And although it's theoretically possible that you could execute a processing agreement with the Northwest Shelf and agree a tariff, I really think it's very unlikely that you'll have any kind of firm agreements with the Northwest Shelf between the Browse joint venture and the Northwest Shelf venture until the partnership changes are resolved, Chevron's share being sorted out, and being confident that the other joint venturers are either going to sell out, if they sell out doing that, or being confident that they're not going to do that in the foreseeable future. So as I say, I think it's very unlikely any firm decision would be made until all those ownership issues are sorted out. And I might be proven wrong, but that's the way I see it from here. We go to the next slide. You might, nevertheless, I think it's still quite likely that you'll see activity to strengthen the various parties' negotiation position. So you might still see the Browse joint venture actively pursuing other development options, because then that gives them a negotiating position. They can, you know, what we call it, what a West alternative to negotiated agreement in negotiating theory. You know, they can then say to the Northwest Shelf venture, that's fine. If the tariff is at this level, we're not happy with it, we'll go and do something else, like, for example, floating LNG or some of the other concepts that have been developed. As I say, also the economics change all the time of the other development concepts, as particularly as relatively new technology becomes more proven, like, for example, floaters and floating LNG. And equally, the Northwest Shelf venture needs to keep the plant full, and if the Browse development gets further delayed, they need to find another backfill option. We go to the next slide. We can see, so what does all that mean? Well, one of the important things is that there's other competing projects. There's other alternatives for backfill to Northwest Shelf other than Browse. In my opinion, the most likely candidate is Scarborough, which is a large, very clean, relatively dry gas field 280 kilometres offshore. At the moment, that's currently planned to underpin a second train at Pluto, but Pluto and the Northwest Shelf venture both have gas plants in Karratha, and so it would make sense to it's a logical option to put Scarborough into the Northwest Shelf venture. If we look at the next slide, you'll be able to see that, you know, here is the schematic of Karratha. You'll see the Northwest Shelf gas plant and then the Pluto gas plant are both in the Karratha area. They're quite close. There's no technical reason why you couldn't put Scarborough gas through the Karratha gas plant, and that would make a lot of sense. Going to the next slide, if we look at other options other than Scarborough as Northwest Shelf backfill, there's also a lot of other gas discoveries in the Carnarvon Basin. Chevron in particular have been enormously successful in Carnarvon Basin exploration. I think their result is 23 discoveries out of 24 wells drilled. Somebody will know that number exactly, but they have been phenomenally successful and very impressively so. However, conversely, we now have, for better or worse, a whole bunch of LNG plants up and down the WA coast. We have Prelude as floating LNG, obviously, but we have Northwest Shelf Venture and Pluto both at Karratha, as I said, Gorgon on Barrow Island, and Wheatstone at Ashburton North. So although there's a lot of gas discoveries, there's also a lot of LNG facilities where that gas could be liquefied if we were going to go to LNG. We go to the next slide. You will see that's a map of the Carnarvon Basin discoveries. As I say, the red is gas and the green is oil. You know, there's some really huge gas fields out there, some of which have been discovered, developed, they've all been discovered. For example, Io-Jans, which is part of the Gorgon project. But there's still a whole bunch of discoveries out there that could all be potentially tied back to the Karratha gas plant or one of the other gas plants up and down the coast. So that was kind of what I wanted to say about the options for Browse or alternatives coming back to the Northwest Shelf venture. And it will be interesting to see how that all plays out. As I say, my money's on a significant delay as a result of the changes in ownership, but I might be wrong. However, what I want to then tease out briefly as we finish off the presentation is the national emphasis on gas-led economic recovery relevant to any of this discussion? So as we look at post-COVID economic recovery around Australia, there's a talk of a gas-led economic recovery. And for those of us in the gas industry, you know, that's nice words. Doesn't really mean anything for Browse in particular and WA in general. This economic recovery is really mostly about domestic gas supply to the eastern seaboard, going into the manufacturing industries in particular, and into potentially into power plants, to provide cheaper power to the manufacturing industry. A lot of focus on the manufacturing industry, and I would argue quite a lot of politics around that as well. There has been some talk about a west to east gas pipeline. In my opinion, that's an expensive option that could not be commercially economic on a commercial basis without some sort of heavy government subsidy, which I don't think is a good idea, and it would take very many decades to implement. And in fact, if you want to know all about that, look at my previous presentation when we looked at that. But I'm not really a big fan of the idea of a west to east gas pipeline for Australia. It's too far, too expensive, and would take too long. However, a number of proponents are proposing LNG regas terminals up and down the east coast. And in my opinion, that's a pretty good answer. I don't think all of them will go ahead, but you'll see there's at least 4 that are under development, and there's a lot of discussion around that. And the technology is well established. Other countries that are major LNG producers, such as Australia, also have LNG regas terminals. For example, Indonesia is an major LNG producer, but because of their geography, they also have solved this challenge to a certain extent by floating LNG regas units on some of the islands, and there's one on Bali. So I think that's a good answer for Australia, and as I say, my previous presentation looked at that in a bit more detail if you're interested. So the impact for WA in particular, I think if East Coast gas demand were to increase significantly as a result of significant investment in manufacturing, for example, it could provide an opportunity for WA LNG producers just to produce more LNG. But I think from where we sit economically, particularly given the size of the Victorian economy that's been shut down for so long, I think that we'll be struggling just to return to pre-COVID levels of demand. We'd have to, nationally, we would have to be doing some pretty amazing things to increase the gas demand beyond the COVID levels as we come out of the Victorian shutdown in particular. So in my opinion, the impact on WA is minimal, other than potentially an increase in gas demand, which would be quite difficult to achieve in Victoria at the moment. But it might result in a greater community acceptance of gas as a transition fuel as we talk about gas-led economic recovery, and as potentially the community sees the value of that. The national impact. The Commonwealth is proposing a big stick approach, primarily around the domestic gas market and particularly power generation. So they've said we want a gas-fired power plant with an FID of April 2021, which is like 5 months away, or we the Commonwealth, will intervene. This is really, really detrimental to investor confidence. And as Australia gets away with having a high cost rate base in project execution and productivity challenges because of its reputation as a secure investment destination. And the idea of a government coming in and saying, you know, you've got 5 months to get your project to FID, which is a very short time. This was an announcement a little while ago, so they had a bit more time, but a short time to get your project to FID, or we're going to intervene, really undermines the abilities of investors to make sound commercial decisions. Go to the next slide. What's the national impact? So the Commonwealth is talking about investing in gas infrastructure. You know, now in my opinion, that's just nationalisation. I don't see any way that it's not. And I would argue that government is, and I know there's some people here who sort of have this background who might disagree with me, but I would argue that government is very, very bad at investing in projects. It's not what they do. What I would argue that what we need our government to do is facilitating and enabling investment, indeed regulating investment, for example, NOPSEMA, but to actually make a commercial investment, I think there's lots of examples where that's gone very bad for the taxpayer and public funds. And I would argue that the government should steer clear of that. And then finally, I think this is my final slide. What So my proposal is what we should be asking for to resolve these issues. My wish list that we would ask government for is, first of all, clear policy. Even if you don't like the policy, at least you need clarity and you need to know what it is. Certainty, and that's really difficult with COVID and the extreme lockdown in Victoria and the uncertainty about the economic impact of that. I would argue definitely not nationalisation. Support to investors in terms of regulator environment and facilitation of approvals, that kind of thing. And the government as a facilitator and not an investor. So it's 4:45. That was all I had for today. And I think I'm right on time. But anyway, I think we're going to, John is going to take over and then facilitate the Q&A.
I am indeed, and here I am. You've got a lot of people asking questions. Yeah, thank you, first of all. That was great. Really, a lot of information there to take in, and I was, I've learned a lot more now, which is great, and and it's good for us. I mean, because we've had quite a few presentations, including last week, on the climate change issue, but it's good for us to know about how the commercial realities of these sorts of developments are also sort of factored in, because it's not, clearly there's a whole lot of issues to be looked at. And some obviously put the climate change one at the top, but there's also lots of, we think of this as just being, it's emissions versus and gas versus renewables, but we forget that these big players have these other issues that they're also dealing with in terms of corporate ownership and joint ventures. So, putting all that in the mix makes it for a pretty interesting story. Now, you've got a lot of questions, obviously a very expert audience with lots of things to ask, and it probably won't surprise you that quite a few of them are actually more about the emissions side of things. But Klaus, who I think is probably Klaus Otto, hi Klaus, at Curtin University, is asking, the browser will emit more CO2 to produce a tonne of LNG than any current Australian LNG project. So what does Peter Coleman and the various JV partners do about that? And there are other questions about this issue, about the risk side in terms of emissions targets by export partners to projects like Browse and Burrup. Deloitte had a report recently about the impact of climate change, so how can we justify doing any more? I asked a question, I had a question, which was basically, given the time frame to actually develop such a big field, I mean, has it just missed its moment? Maybe 10 years ago, potentially gas was the transitional fuel, but it never happened. James Price Point didn't happen. Has it just missed the boat, to be honest, given all the other issues that are going on, A, in terms of competing projects, but B, in terms of, in particular, the emissions and the climate change issue, in a sense, has it just missed the boat? So all those things are together, but just maybe have a talk about the emission side of things in the first place, and maybe the specifics of Browse versus other ones.
Yeah, thanks, John. Certainly, Browse has certainly has challenges with CO2 emissions. You compare with other high CO2 projects, and we're doing a good job of developing technology around that. We have the world's largest carbon geosequestration on the Gorgon project, but you know that that was new technology and didn't start up as cleanly as people would have liked, and was slow to start up. So like most technological developments, it hasn't happened as quickly and easily as you would hope. There's certainly technology solutions, as I say, including geosequestration. But yes, that is a really significant factor that plays to the competitors, particularly Scarborough. Scarborough is a fantastic gas field. It was discovered in 1979. I first worked on it in 1981. It's been around for a while. But, Scarborough is a really, really nice gas reservoir. So that, in my opinion, just plays into the value of alternative gas supplies, for example, Scarborough and some of the other discoveries versus developing Browse, which kind of segues into, has Browse missed the boat, with the pun around that. A delay, as I said, delay changes all the relative economics, including the LNG market. The changing ownership almost certainly delivers delay. I cannot imagine people, although it's theoretically possible, I cannot imagine making a major final investment decision while you've got uncertainty of the ownership. So I think there is a very real argument that maybe Browse should be shelved for another. It was discovered in 1971. You know, another 10 years, another 20 years. Maybe Browse's time has not come. The final issue I'd make on that, in terms of other competing high CO2 projects, is a project in Natuna, in Indonesia, called Natuna, that's been around for just as long. Everybody in the industry has worked on it at some time, and it has a really high CO2 content, and it has struggled for decades and decades to get up and running. So maybe the ultimate outcome is Browse does get shelved for the moment until we get better at managing the CO2 and develop better technologies.
So this longer time frame, on the one hand, of course, you know, the government's trying to promote gas. On the other hand, and you've got some saying, well, it's the transitional fuel. But the longer it takes, and its particularities seem to be it's worse than its potential competitors. It seems to me that it's basically it's just being pushed further and further out. Is that a fair comment?
You'll have to wait and see. I think it's very likely.
And your corporate side of things, you're not great knowledge there. I mean, and Klaus's question talked about, you know, how do the corporate leaders of these companies deal with that? I mean, have they effectively got a stranded asset, and what does that do to their corporation in terms of valuations and all that sort of stuff? I mean, and they wouldn't be alone. There's a whole lot of these companies with massive assets, but you know, they're assets in theory, but they may not actually be assets in reality if they're never going to get developed.
Yeah, and that is part of the challenge. So Browse discovered in 71, discovered in 79. Both are projects that are trying to get developed now and may or may not happen. There was some discussion with the federal government, with the previous minister about taking away the retention leases, use it or lose it. But it is true that all the joint venture partners in any asset are taking this as a discovery, and a discovery that has intrinsic value that's in their balance sheet. And although you can kind of recognise delay and keep postponing, to say never is difficult, because then you'd lose your retention lease, and it would be difficult in that relationship. But it's also difficult commercially, where you say, hey, we told your shareholders for decades and decades that this thing was worth a lot of money, but now it's not. So I think the way of dealing with that is saying, historically and potentially in the future, way of dealing with it historically is saying it's not commercial at current prices, but in the future it's likely to be as prices change. I think the other element of that, particularly with the climate change debate, is not commercial in the current context, both price, but also technology. But maybe in the future, as technology develops and we have better emissions management technology, then maybe we would see that. So that might be the conversation you're having with the regulator. It might be the conversation you're having with your shareholders. But I do agree that if you spend a lot of time saying you're partners in this great big gas field that's worth billions of dollars, and then to say we're never going to develop it, that's really difficult.
A question, and there's a couple of related. One was saying, can I go back to the issue was about you know, the risk issue with if we have partners who decide to have targets, you know, emission targets, and say, well, we're not going to take your gas because Australia is, you know, a high emitter, and that, you know, the European Union. I know most of our gas is sold, I assume, to Japan and China and wherever. But if we have export partners who then start putting on targets, and well, that's a huge risk for us, isn't it? And which would make the project even less likely.
I think that relates to the whole global LNG business. I don't think Australia's in any more difficult or less situation than any other country. It's true that a place like the EU are tightening up on targets. Generally, our our LNG is sold to Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, India. But as they tighten up their targets, and then we will have to comply with that. And that, again, development of carbon capture technology is really important. But we're no different to other major LNG producers, like, for example, Indonesia or anywhere else in the world.
Sure. Again, this is more of a sort of a natural environment one as opposed to climate change. About if there are several gas fields in the area already, why are we choosing to drill inside the Scott Reef, considering it's got a strict nature reserve status? Is that where Browse is, or is that another development?
So Tarosa, yeah, is partially underneath Scott Reef. You can certainly develop the field without drilling in Scott Reef. There's directional drilling. I don't actually know whether any of the wells are, where the well locations are, and at what level that is developed. But there's certainly easy ways of dealing with that with remote tiebacks and things like that.
Sure. I'll just move on to a couple of other things. I had a really dumb question, which I'm going to ask just to show my ignorance. If we talk about shared infrastructure, and there's another shared infrastructure question coming up, but you've got a pipeline going to Darwin, and from the sound of it, Browse is just down the road, figuratively speaking. I mean, do gas developments ever share pipeline infrastructure from? Why wouldn't you go to Darwin? I mean, you're talking about you're talking about the sharing of infrastructure on land, but I don't know. Can you piggyback on gas infrastructure or pipelines, or does that not happen?
The short answer is not in Australia, for arguably not very good reasons. So certainly we have an appalling record of sharing infrastructure. So we have, as we say, ICFA's going to Darwin. We're talking about Browse coming down to Karratha. There's pipelines. The Wheatstone pipeline is coming down from right near where some of the Northwest Shelf pipelines are coming. We have a pipeline network all over offshore WA that could be highly consolidated. If, in fact, Chevron proposed a couple of years ago to put in a shared pipeline throughout the Carnarvon Basin, where all the Northwest Shelf venture fields are, and operate that as a shared pipeline. And that made an awful lot of sense. It was a really good idea. I haven't seen much activity about that since then, but I'm a fan of that. In the US, it's well established. There's really good networks and shared processing facilities and hubs and so on. And there's the commercials of just infrastructure operators are well established. In Norway, for example, you're told you have to do it. It's mandated. But here in Australia, it's a bit of a free for all.
And there's no. Sorry, I've still got. I mean, Stuart asked the same question. I've asked. Yeah. What is the? It's the same companies often involved. It seems, from an outsider's point of view, like massive waste of resources to have these separate developments. I mean, I know there's been discussion in the iron ore industry about the same thing. Is this just not done? This is just not the Australian way from what
It's an un-Australian. And for the coal seam gas plants, there's 3 LNG plants side by side on Curtis Island in Queensland, in Gladstone, 3 side by side. Fantastic project for the contractor because they got all 3 and could share their resources across them. Fantastic. Is it just un-Australian? Part of it is because there's no mandate and no forcing. Part of it is because there's not already the commercial structure like there is in the Gulf of Mexico. But I don't know. It's just crazy from my point of view.
Okay. Okay. Given the strategic importance of these reserves and the limited oil reserves we've got, why is that issue having a limited impact on the policy agenda? And of course, we just had the BP refinery announcement just the other day as well. So again, where's the active government role in this, to some extent, in this issue in terms of gas availability within Australia? I mean, of course, it's talked about on the East Coast, but on the West Coast, not so much.
Yeah, I'm involved in quite a number of Commonwealth national forums, and dear old WA gets forgotten except for the economic impact. So I think that a lot of the COVID-led gas recovery and all the COVID economic stuff is really around the eastern seaboard. you could argue that's really important given how Victoria suffered. But I was having a conversation with somebody about this yesterday. There's a real opportunity for that that Commonwealth policy to also use the opportunity to develop advanced manufacturing and skills development and industrial development here in WA. And I don't see very much focus on that at all. You know, with apologies to the politicians in the room, you know, I think it's political. I think we're out of sight, out of mind, and as long as we keep providing the revenue, we'll be all right.
In terms of that, I mean, I had a question earlier about Commonwealth versus, I mean, has the Commonwealth got any views on, on browse, or, because I know at James Price's point, it was a very odd sort of lining up of interest at one stage, because you had unions and the, as far as I remember, the coalition government here in Western Australia on one side, wanting development on land, and then you had green environmental movements and the federal government at the time, I think it was a Conservative government, wanting to develop offshore with a floating sort of thing. And these sorts of development, you had different competing interests from the usual ones, basically whether you want to have onshore industrial development or the Commonwealth just get the royalties and minimise the risk. So where's the Commonwealth at the moment, or is it basically I know it's out of sight, out of mind to some extent, but does the Commonwealth have any strong opinion on this, or is it all state government policies what counts?
Well, I think there's some people on the call who probably can answer that better than me, but from where I sit, I think that there was some discussion with the previous Commonwealth Minister in this government talking about you've got to get up and develop browse, and otherwise we'll take away your retrenchment leases, and that minister's not in play anymore. I'm not seeing too much active Commonwealth involvement. It might be there, but I'm not really seeing it. I am seeing the active WA development, but saying the current WA government is saying we want to come to Karratha for jobs and economic development, and the previous one saying we want to go to James Price Point for economic development in the Kimberley. But yeah, currently the only Commonwealth intervention I've seen, Commonwealth response I've seen, is a previous minister talking about getting the project up and running. But I'm not seeing much about that. And I do think, from what I can see, the Commonwealth is very focused on the East Coast gas market, the so-called gas levy recovery in the manufacturing industry.
There's the state government's interest, and there's a question here about, you know, is the state government's interest really about this issue of the below full capacity issue in Karratha? You know, is it smart or ethical to build an untenable project just to reduce the cost of running Karratha below full capacity? I mean, is that the state's interest, or is it more just the potential job issues to do with Karratha?
Well, as far as I can see, that it's more around jobs and industrial development and opportunities in the Karratha area, and of course, you know, you then get into the absolute debate about you know, which has a big impact on the last federal election, the absolute debate about jobs, industrial development, economic well-being versus the type of those industrial developments, and whether that's what you want to do. And you know, that becomes very personal. You know, it depends on where you sit on that spectrum.
But the below capacity issue is more of a issue for the commercial operators rather than the state governments.
Yeah, I don't see any concern about that from the state government point of view. It's just, you know, it's just money, a commercial money to the browse, the Northwest Shelf Venture, just going to cost some money.
Angus King asked a question, which is more of a comment really, about Gorgon, saying how it's only going to sequester 40% of CO2 at most if it does get up and running and doing it properly. So how can you say it's clean? But it's not even there yet at the moment, is that right? I mean, I'm not quite sure what the latest development is there. So, I mean, it was one of the key arguments behind allowing it to go on Barrow Island. So I don't know, I mean, I'm not sure how much knowledge you have of it. I mean, what's your assessment of it now, all those years later, where it's still obviously having trouble?
I'm not super close to it. I'm sort of aware of some of the stuff that, because I'm a Melbourne Uni alumna, the stuff that Melbourne was doing around that, and I knew the people involved. I'm not super close to it. Certainly it was difficult to get it up and running. I really don't know whether it's running full capacity now or not. I'm not, as I say, but certainly my view from the distance is that, you know, it was a significant technological advance that required some really new developments, and that's always difficult. You see that with prelude as well, and it's almost always more difficult than you want it to be and hope it to be, and you know, always becomes a risk.
And have others been learning from it, and hence are there other new developments around the world anywhere that have also tried to do capture and have done better, or are we still the sort of the guinea pig and we're still trying to work it out?
There is a big one in Norway. Yeah, I think it's on the Sleipner field. Somebody might know that. There is a big one in Norway that seems to be going okay. I don't really know the ins and outs as to whether they're using the same technology or not. Norway is very good at that kind of technology and that kind of technology development. One of the reasons I'm quite close to sort of Norwegian policy settings, one of the reasons they're good at it is because they put real government money behind it. And they do get the results as well. So that seems to be going well, maybe a bit better than Gorgon.
Right. A question here about using gas for your car, for people's cars as opposed to petrol. Is that you know, has West Australia been encouraging us to use gas in our cars as opposed to petrol, or is there no real advantage? Or people have got gas in it, you know, taxi drivers used to have gas, gas fueled cars. Is that our LNG? Is that our LPG from our gas fields, or is it something different?
I assume it is. Yeah, it's auto LPG.
Yeah.
Is kind of some ethane, some propane, and some butane. So LNG is mostly methane. So it's just LPG like you get in your barbecue thing, the barbecue gas thing. I think it comes primarily for us from the Kwinana refinery, and that might change. And I assume it's coming from the gas coming out of the pipeline. I really don't know. Somebody else might know that.
I assume it's a pretty, even if everybody converted their, okay, leaving the electric car issue to one side, or the hybrids, if you all converted from petrol driven cars to powered cars to gas ones, it wouldn't make a huge difference to the market of, to the viability of these various gas developments up in the north? Or
oh no, because that's sort of, you know, the fundamental of all this. Perhaps, you know, should have talked about the context a bit more. You know, we have huge world scale gas fields, really large gas fields by world scales, and we have a tiny population primarily in Perth. So whichever way you use it, whether it's for domestic use in a vehicle, or in your gas stove, or for heating, or for a big industrial use, even if you had some really big industrial users, for example, we have Alcoa, but even if you had more of them, it's still essentially the issue is you don't have enough enough people to develop a big enough economy to use it all.
Okay. So let's have a look. Anything else here? We're almost out of time anyway. I'm just going to get on my first question, which was really just my was, you know, should the government, WA government, you know, you mentioned the WA government seems to be the one that's most interested. Should it actually be actively trying to help browse get off the ground, or should it just leave it to the companies and the markets and all these shenanigans and negotiations you're talking about, and be a hands-off, you know, technology neutral, project neutral government, which of course state governments in West Australia traditionally have not been. They've always been pretty hands-on. But could the state government just say, look, up to you guys, Scarborough, Browse, nothing to do with us. You know, you guys work it out, and we'll kick it down the road, and, you know, and basically nothing might happen.
It's complicated by the federalism, because a lot of this is under Commonwealth jurisdiction. The state government has some jurisdiction, but not all of it. So that certainly complicates it. Given that I'm completely against governments of any sort investing in projects, and they would be a really bad investor in a major gas project. They, you know, I would argue they don't have the skills or knowledge or anything. And so what sort of intervention can the state government offer? They can offer support that is kind of useful. I'm against them offering investment money. They can certainly offer training and skills and funds into that kind of space around it. maybe some support to supply chain developments, that sort of thing. But particularly given some of its Commonwealth jurisdiction anyway, you know, there's a limit to what they can do.
Fair enough. Okay, look, I've just noticed the time. It's almost 5:10, so we're probably going to finish.
Gosh.
One last really important question. What's that shirt? What's that signed jacket behind you?
And here's my son in 2005, and he's now this big hairy thing. So and I was on a call the other day, and an Indian colleague could explain to the Norwegians what it was. It's a England cricket shirt. This used to be my husband's office before it was mine. It's weird, I'm at home. And we lived in the UK for a long time, and that was his going away present, signed by all his colleagues.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
So it's not signed by anybody famous, it's just signed by his colleagues.
Oh, okay. So someone asked if it was a, someone said it looked like a Pommy Test cricket shirt. So
it is.
But it's not signed by famous cricketers, is what you're saying. It's signed by his mates.
No.
Okay. Everybody, I don't know where Jeanette lives, but you can't, no point going in and nobody famous has signed it, all right? It's okay. Well, that's terrific, Jeanette. Thanks very much. And yeah, we now know a lot more about not just the Browse project, but I think, like I said, to me, the real value in this is, you know, when especially people, in a sense, you know, who come from an environmental perspective or other perspectives, to know that a lot of these decisions are made with a lot of other things in mind.
Yeah.
You know, and how the as I said, the interaction between these massive companies and what they're thinking about is maybe a light years away from what we think are the major considerations. So it's important for everybody to know what they're actually what they are actually considering in making their decisions, and of course to try and you know, maybe input other considerations into that decision making. So thanks again for completing the trifecta and giving us another talk on the LNG industry in Western Australia, and it's great for you to do so. So thanks again, and we'll hopefully maybe find another one for you to do down the track. Okay. And now to everybody.